Stay tuned. Ahead, I'll talk with entomologist Barrett Klein about the Insect Epiphany, how our six-legged allies shape human culture. We'll learn about how insects play a fundamental role in what makes us human. Hi, I'm Dan Skinner, and this is Some Books Considered. Entomologist Barrett Klein studies the curious connections that bind our lives with our six-legged allies and believes that embracing the beauty of insects can transform our lives and our world. He joins us to discuss his Insect Epiphany. Barrett, welcome to Some Books Considered.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with you.
Now, you talk about this in the introduction to your book, but share with us your inspiration for why you wanted to become an entomologist.
That was so easy, being surrounded by this wealth and diversity of forms, shapes, colors, variety of behavior of insects. It was really difficult not to be consumed and smitten by the insects around me. Here you have these accessible little marvels. And growing up on the edge of Detroit with my mom's beautiful garden, attracting these pollinating insects and others, stag beetles rising from the earth, hummingbird butterflies tending to her flowers, I couldn't help but be drawn.
In the introduction of your book, you also write that insects play a fundamental role in what it means to be human. And you asked us to imagine a world without insects, which, when you get right down to it, we may not even exist without insects.
That's right. And some people term the roles insects play as ecosystem services. So I mentioned pollinators, insects serving with fruiting, flowering plants as the go-betweens to bring sperm to egg. But also you have soil aerators, nutrient dispersers, decomposers. We'd be in rubble up to our knees in cadavers and dung were it not for insects. So you have all these ecosystem services and food for others. So scrape away the 10 quintillion insects or so, and you'd have these rippling effects that would dramatically decrease and eliminate species of the vertebrates we love, from fish to amphibians to birds and other reptiles and mammals. And yes, we'd soon follow as ecosystems crumble.
One of the things that you note in the book is that insects get a bad rap. But in the scheme of things, it's only a very, very small amount of insects that actually cause us harm. Everyone else in the insect world is doing us a favor.
That's right. Thank you for pointing that out, because we tend to focus on this sliver, these meager components of this vast tree of hexapod life. Right now, there are 1.1 million described species of insects, with nobody knows how many more times of undescribed species there may be out there. And we tend to focus on the hundreds or a couple of thousand that can do us some harm. And some, I can't dismiss, do intense harm to humans. We can look to the Anopheles mosquito as a vector of a single-celled eukaryote, Plasmodium, that causes well over 500,000 deaths due to malaria, and a series of other diseases, stripping of crops by some. So yes, insects can cause harm, but if we focus on them and deny the great value of the vast trove of other insect species, we'd be short-sighted and in trouble.
Well, this is a fascinating book. There's so much information here. We're not going to be able to talk about it all in this brief interview. So give us a brief overview of what readers will find here and a bit about how it's organized.
Yeah, that was a fun challenge, because to talk about this huge taxon, this lineage of life, and all of its effects on humans throughout our history and across our cultures would have been impossible to do comprehensively. So I wondered, should I do a chronological, historical take? Should I do a thematic take? Should I look at taxon to taxon, like butterflies, bees, and list goes on? I decided to approach it the way I'd most want to read it or think about it. And I had great fun telling stories. And the way I divided it up was to think in terms of how we've used or exploited insects in different ways, their products, their bodies, whether it be for industrial gain, economic pursuits, artistic inspiration. And then I moved from this exploitation, using them, to building them, or in some way replacing the real insect with biomimicry, engineers looking to insects, architects looking to insects. And then I went to imitating insects. The last one is metamorphosis, becoming insects. And this might sound odd, but we actually look to insects in terms of decision making, as well as the inspiration, whether it be to fight like an insect, dance like an insect, act like an insect, sound like an insect. So in many ways, our cultures are woven with the fabric of insects and their behaviors that completes our own.
I'm talking with entomologist Barret Klein about the Insect Epiphany, how our six-legged allies shape human culture. And our conversation continues in a moment. If you're enjoying this discussion, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. And thank you. Well, let's go back and dip into each of those categories just a little bit to give people a taste of what's in this book. And for example, you talk about the products, and some of them are obvious to most people. You think of honey and wax and other things, but what are some of the more unusual things that insects provide us that people may not be aware of?
Well, your listeners, viewers might be drinking a beverage, consuming some food, putting on cosmetic, or wearing clothing, or have art on the wall that might all be colored with what Amy Butler Greenfield called the perfect red, a scarlet from a cochineal bug that would live on Opuntia prickly pear cactus in a desert. And over thousands of years, the Aztec people and Maya had domesticated or reared these scale bugs that don't look like insects at all until the little winged male flies to find the female. She's under this waxy exudate and antidesiccant so she doesn't dry out and protects her from parasites and predators. But if you scrape those insects off, dry them, pulverize them, and you can crush a live one, and you get this brilliant scarlet. Add a mordant to fabric, and you get a full spectrum of colors from a scarlet to a purple that have been used throughout the world of fabrics and art. So upon penalty of death, people weren't to export the secret of this wormberry or whatever it was from the deserts of Mexico, say, until 1777, a French botanist smuggled them out. And you had the Spanish conquistadors in the meantime had exported them to the old world, and the export was huge economically and transformed the use of red, influencing, for example, the choice of color used by the clergy, by Caesar, by the nobility. And only the rich and famous could afford this organic red until it spread and took over other organic red sources. And that's only one scale insect. Another, the lac insect, which is still collected by a couple of million humans in Thailand and India, is the base for not only a different red dye, but also the shellac that can cover maybe even your wood desk in front of you, or the shiny apple that you ate this morning, for example. So much of the world around us has been coated with shellac, at least historically. So these are two insects that are surprises. A third that's a big surprise to me is, well, look to the most famous documents in history, or some of the greatest artworks in history. And behind that, maybe the oak tannins from a gall, a protective measure by the plant that's chemically induced by different species of gall wasps. So gall wasp females might lay an egg inside. The plant protects itself. Meanwhile, the developing young of the gall wasp does beautifully with food and shelter, but tannins build up, and we've used this, extracted those tannins as a very simple process, a very simple recipe to produce an ink that's long-lasting. So the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Magna Carta limiting the powers of King John of England, for example, all written with this ink induced by the gall wasp. Plus, you've got Van Gogh drawings and Beethoven's works, and the list goes on. You could also look to the Star-Spangled Banner, and the red stripes are thanks to that scale insect we mentioned before, the cochineal bug.
In the middle section of your book, you talk about the ways that we're mimicking insects, and it's influencing things like creating robots and exoskeletons and all those kind of scientific developments that we've been taking lessons from the insect world.
Yes. So I was intrigued by a story from the 1970s, a top secret mission by the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency to try to create one of our first real functional micro-aerial robots in the service of espionage. And so at first they thought Bumblebee will do it. But the Bumblebee isn't a really erratic flyer, didn't really work out. So they scrapped those notes. And there was an amateur dragonfly enthusiast on the team. And he said, how about, and essentially pointed to a green darner, an Anax junius, which is a large dragonfly. So they manufactured this. You have a gas-operated motor in the thorax, a little bimetallic strip that drips off the abdomen, and glass beads for eyes, with the idea that it could be laser-guided and that any conversation would deform the glass beads such that you could recreate the conversation. Problem was a slight crosswind, and the dragonfly goes too far off course. Now others have followed, and now we've got a robo-bee and all kinds of fly-mimicking robots, as well as cockroach-like hexapod robots that can travel over uneven terrain. Now this is really valuable if you want to go into a war zone or a rubble to find a human that may still be alive, or you want to take on interplanetary travel and traverse the terrain of Mars, for example. So yes, lots of robots, not just on land, but on water, with hopping and skimming water strider mimics. List goes on.
And in the final section, it's a lot about culture and how insects have influenced our culture, from the actual insects appearing throughout different media, but also it's inspired others, like yourself, in your creation of art that you like to do.
That's right. And it starts with, I think, decision-making, where some humans look to ants or honeybees to see how efficiently they travel or transport cargo in the case of leafcutter ants, or make democratic decisions in the case of honeybee colonies, deciding on how to find a new home, all the way to, as you say, the arts. So insects as muses used by dancers, painters, actors, etc. So some of my favorites include music, where humans will either be inspired by the rhythms created by, say, singing cicadas or crickets, all the way to incorporating those first musicians as earthlings into their music compositions. One of the most convincing imitations to me comes from the Dong people of China, where women in a chorus will engage in a mimicry of a cacophony of cicadas, male singing cicadas, with a na 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 na, and the harmonies and melodies of just the voice. And then a couple performing a traditional Filipino musical piece using bamboo zithers, also to recreate the cicada courtship calls of males.
And as I mentioned, it's influenced you as well. Obviously, this is your field of study, but in terms of artistic endeavors.
I love to collaborate with insects, and when I keep honeybees at a friend's orchard, sometimes I'll take a recycled bicycle helmet with a little bit of beeswax on top of it, insert it in the hive, and see how they build, how their gorgeous architecture works with that helmet, and then I'll sculpt along with them to create some larger piece.
There's so much more in this book that we won't have time to talk about. So what kind of new appreciation of insects do you hope readers will take from this book?
Beyond what we described as the ecosystem services, seeing just how instrumental insects are in the stability of our ecosystems, I'd love for people to take away some of the explicit, but also some of the hidden, clandestine ways that insects permeate our culture positively, and open our eyes and minds to the ways that we might engage in our independent, individual, and personal relationships with insects more. So we can change from a tolerating of insects to a celebrating of insects.
To learn more, the book is The Insect Epiphany: How Our Six-Legged Allies Shape Human Culture by Barret Klein. Barret, thank you for talking with me today.
Wow, thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun. I really appreciate it.
If you'd like to purchase The Insect Epiphany, I've placed a link for you in the description below. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe, like, and click on the bell so you know when I post new interviews. Meanwhile, here are 2 more interviews you might find interesting. I'm Dan Skinner. Thank you for watching this edition of Some Books Considered.